Hello, everybody. This is Jeude. I'm a practice leader in AIM, responsible for healthcare, but I've also worked on a number of strategy and consulting projects over the years. What I wanted to do in the next 10 minutes or so is walk through what it means to think like a consultant without actually being a consultant. Now, a class to become a consultant, to think like a consultant in a classic sense, in a McKinsey sense, to learn how to articulate strategy, build out themes, is a really important topic, and it's well beyond the scope of what we're going to do today. I'll be explaining why I think it's important that we carry a consultative mindset with us in Cognizant in all of our interactions. I'll give you some models to take with you to use when you're interacting with clients and thinking about how to extract information. And I'll also leave you with some thoughts on presenting your final conclusions. So let's jump right into it. When I joined Cognizant 7 years ago, we were already in a transition from being purely a source of labor to being a partner that actually helped companies strategically. In the center of the activity, we were good at, and we still are very good at, building. We built excellent software, and I'll get to that in a few minutes on where that fits with dialogue. And we knew how to keep it running, we knew how to make it reliable, and we consistently grew our business based on the strength of our ability to build software. We recognized well before I joined Cognizant, though, that in order to grow, we needed to be involved in other parts of the business. So we began to talk with our clients about planning before they build and about operating after they build. So this model of plan, build, and operate has different ways of wording it, but it really talks about us being a partner with our clients from the very beginning. Why did they decide they needed that project? And to the very end when they operate it and make sure that the outcomes are what they expected. Now, this model itself has matured considerably as our clients have raised their expectation of what they want from us at Cognizant and what they want from systems integrators like our competitors in general. I'm going to spend a little bit of time and really talk about the planning phase and where we can bring a consultative mindset even if we're not, strictly speaking, full-time business consultants. Everyone in Cognizant needs to think like a consultant at the right moment in time, even if you're not doing a strategy project. So let's take this planning a little bit and think about what it is that causes people to decide, and clients of ours to decide that they want a project in the first place. Once they've articulated it, if we get an RFP and we respond to that RFP, that's important, but we're actually behind. If we don't know why they floated the RFP, if we don't know it's a project underneath a program underneath the strategy, if we don't know what business problem at a very high level they're trying to solve, we can bid on that headcount or that very technical thing. We can bid on upgrading from one release to another of a certain piece of software, but we lose sight of the fact that it's part of a bigger picture. And if we're not thinking along those lines, carrying those terms, and having conversations in terms of outcome, we'll be seen as someone very much like calling in a plumber rather than calling in an architect. And we want to be the architects of our clients' future. If we look at what happens with planning, what I like to sometimes do is go back to a phrase I heard years ago, and it comes from Warren Buffett, the great investor. Warren said that basically everyone, when they invest, are driven by one of two impulses. They're either driven by fear or they're driven by greed. And when you think about it, when you're making some kind of investment, you're either trying to avoid a negative outcome, you're hedging your bet, you're buying insurance, you're doing something to try to make sure that the worst case doesn't become the worst case, or you're reaching for something aspirational. What I like to do, instead of talking about fear and greed, which sound a little bit negative, is change that a little differently to talk about anxiety and aspiration. And I've written on this topic in my blog on the ANN if you want to take a look. Now, why am I telling you about anxiety and aspiration? Are we here to get a psychology lesson, or are we here to talk about strategy and consulting? Well, as you can probably imagine where I'm headed, if you understand what's driving the companies you're working for and the individual within that company, you'll have a much better idea on how to position yourself. If they're anxiety driven, if they're really trying to take a defensive posture like we find a lot of our clients in 2008 and 2009 during the financial collapse, you have a very different set of terms you use, a very different way in which you reassure them that you'll be able to help them preserve what they have and hold on until they see what the future brings. If you're interested in clients that have an aspiration, it's a very different story. It's about going after new markets, meeting new customers, getting into new product lines, having a new level of engagement with them. Now, they're both legitimate, of course, but you really need to have a rough idea of what's driving the client to form the projects that lead us to the center part where we're doing the building. So I hope that makes sense. Don't think in terms of fear and greed. That sounds a little negative. You can actually ask them explicitly. I would never go to a client and say, what makes you fearful or what makes you greedy? But I would go to them and said, what makes you anxious? And what is your aspiration for this? Whether they're trying to grow their market share or defend their market share makes a big difference. So let's talk a little bit about how, once we understand what's driving the clients at a fundamental level to form the strategies, the programs, and the projects that we're responding to, how do we react to that when we have those conversations? So I'm going to flip to a new chart. Some of you may have already seen this, but I think it's always a good model to carry around in the back of your mind when you're having a conversation. If you know what's driving the client's conversation, the next question is, where do you take it? So like any good consultant, I'm going to draw a 2x2 grid. And the top right corner, like any good strategy grid, is going to be the ideal place. And the bottom left is where you don't want to be. So let me draw a grid here that has two axes. On the one axis, it's the way in which we engage. The other axis is going to be whether it's a one-time problem or repeatable. So let me label this as as distinct. And I hope you can read my handwriting across the room. And the other one is going to be common. Now, like I said, with any good strategy diagram, there is a tip for you there. You generally want people to focus on the top right. For example, high growth, high ability to execute. Or in the case of Gartner, it would be strategic vision and ability to execute. Now, what goes down here, then I talked about our level of engagement. The simplest level of engagement, and we have to do this well, I don't mean to belittle this at all, is you have to listen. And then the more advanced level of engagement is you need to lead. So let's think about where we might be on this conversation. Let's say that a client has come to us with a project and we're in the opportunity to do the RFP and respond to that. We're in the middle of that plan, build, operate chain that I talked about on the previous page. We don't have the opportunity at that point to begin to fuss and say, why didn't you invite us to the planning phase? That's a fact that we should take back to the account team and take back to Cognizant Business Consulting and ask ourselves what we can do to be at the table when the strategies turned into programs and the programs turned into projects and the projects get put out to bid. I guarantee if we're hearing about an RFP for the first time, we have a good chance of winning it, but our competitors were probably at the table when the strategy was set up that led to that project being formed in the first place. Nobody wants to be in the position of finding out last about one of these opportunities. So for whatever reason, let's take here on this diagram, we're ready to talk about a given project. Or it could be that you're in a project and you're interacting with the client on a very specific request. Most of our revenue, and in fact, most of our lives in programming and IT have been in this corner, and there's nothing wrong with that. You listen to what you're told, and you have a distinct solution to the client's needs, their environment, their situation, their timeline, their budget. Now, if I'm telling you the bottom left is not good and you should always aspire to the top right, why am I saying this is a good place to be? Well, you really, unless you're a peer sort of strategy group like a McKinsey or someone at the very high end, nobody gets to live in the exotic area of leading conversations and walking away without doing work, except a very, very small number of consultants. And that's not us listening to this video. We have to deliver and we have to satisfy our clients. That ability to listen carefully, to articulate their requirements, to feed them back, to get a sign off, to track against closure, to use automation tools, to use the hero principles, to reduce complexity. All of that is very important. Most of our revenue actually comes from this spot, or at least most of our opportunity to have deeper conversations. So I'm going to take it as a given that you know how to listen and you know how to build distinct solutions. What I'd like you to do is think like a consultant at this level. Now again, this is not strategy consulting like our clients are aging or a new competitor is entering the market. These are not conversations we're talking about today. That's a different kind of consulting education. You're listening to a distinct problem and you're going to build that distinct solution. we have a couple of ways we can carry this conversation. One way, which is useful, instead of having a distinct solution, ask ourselves whether or not we built accelerators and tools that will have a common solution for that problem. For example, let's say that a client comes and says, I would like to onboard social media data, and I would like to know how to read Twitter feeds, and not only do I want Facebook, which is the obvious one, but I'd like to read the comments fields of articles of topic of interest to my market in the 20 largest newspapers in America. We know how to do that. We know how to scrape the web. We know how to scrape comments. We know how to onboard. What we could do is, instead of saying which 20 newspapers and what's their format and doing a distinct solution, we could carry the conversation and say, we have an accelerator or we have a tool that already knows how to read social media. We think it's going to take you 80% of the way there. The other 20% might be something unique to your market. Maybe there's a trade magazine. Maybe you sell through distributors and not to consumers, and you want to find out what they're thinking. But what we could do is say, hey, I hear you, and by the way, instead of doing this as a one-off, we have tools that's going to reduce our cost. Now let's pause there for 1 second while I keep building this out and ask ourselves, why would James tell me that we should reduce the revenue that we're going to get on a project by bringing in an accelerator or a tool instead of doing it as a bespoke solution? Well, two things. We all know that in this highly competitive world, if there's a solution out there, word's going to get out, and the value of that automation is going to fall to the client ultimately, and not solely to Cognizant. That is, if we can automate that and do it cheaper, better, faster, we can't expect to necessarily save all of that difference between doing it the hard way and doing it the easy way. What we have to do is assume that the client's going to find out, or the competitors of ours will bring in similar tools. That's what makes competition so wonderful, and technology continuously improves the breed. In addition to that, there are times that if we can negotiate an outcome-based model, for example, we promise to onboard social media and they give us a starter kit. If we use tools and accelerators, we do get to pocket the difference. That is, we get to pocket the productivity improvement and reinvest that in other ways. Now, this is really a technical conversation where you might be talking to a technologist, and instead of saying, I'll write it for you, we can talk about information factories, data ingestion layers, data integration workshop. I hope you've heard those terms, particularly now around DIW and the Big Decisions platform. But what about the consulting angle? If a client says, I'd like to onboard social media data, I would hope by the time I'm done with this conversation, your first thought is not, oh, do I have a tool? Your first thought should be to engage the client in what they're trying to do with that. Now, some of that may be technical. If you understand why they're asking the question, if you understand what's driving, you might learn something about formats and latency and frequency and granularity. But it also lets you get into a conversation where instead of listening, you're actually leading. So you could say, yes, we know how to onboard social media data. In fact, we've done 100 projects in that space. We're the leaders in digital. And we've got you covered. By the way, what are you trying to do with that? Are you looking at from a brand perspective? Are you looking at it in terms of advertising responsiveness? Have you seeded a new phrase or a new concept in your advertising, and you want to see whether people pick that up and start using it in daily life? Are you interested in legislation? Perhaps there's some law that might turn against you or turn in your favor. You want to find out what people are saying. Are you interested in competitive threats? That you want to find out what the early indicators are to new entrants in the market. You begin having those conversations, and suddenly you're leading the conversation on what's really kind of a CBC level conversation, which is, that's interesting, why do you want to do that? And they might say, well, we believe that social media is a predictor of churn. And you could say, okay, let's have a conversation, or can I have you meet with somebody from our analytics team? Because churn can be both aggregate and individual. We can help you predict both, and on the individual level, we can help you come up with the next best action. We have a practice in that space, and they'll say, oh, I didn't know that. So here we are with listening and leading the conversation, and instead of giving a distinct answer, we have a common answer. Now, what did I just tell you about 5 minutes ago? The place to be on any good two-dimensional strategy is, I can't hear you guys, but it's the top right corner, right? So what would be an example of these two vectors coming together? This vector is very often led by business And this vector is very often led by IT. So if you remember anything about your high school math, they join up here in the top right corner, and that's where we'd like to have complete solutions. Or as I like to say, the 80% solution. I'll get to that in just a moment. An ideal outcome to the scenario I just described is where the client says, can you help me onboard social media data? We may be talking to someone that's our counterpart on the project at a level where they're responsible for data integration, data quality, hitting timelines, and hitting SLAs. That person may not be in the mood at that time to start talking about the grand philosophy of social media as a predictor of churn, a predictor of competitor entrance, a predictor of legislative outcome, a predictor of economic activity in your sector. Those are great questions, but you got to know when to bring it up. If somebody rushes in and said, we've just onboarded, an entirely new retail chain, and we have to do social media around what people think of our product now being in their stores, you don't want to get into a philosophical conversation around legislation, strategy, and a 2020 plan. But you should be able to find the business person that wants to have those conversations, and you should be able to find the person on the technology side that would recognize the benefits of a common solution instead of a distinct solution. So really, it's a very simple model. I would also recommend, at the risk of sounding like a motivational speaker, this model can apply in your personal life. If you're having an interaction with your family, your children, a spouse, or something like that, ask yourself whether the conversation is really about the specific issue at that specific moment in time, or whether it's something that could be repeatedly handled. For example, my children are grown now, but when they struggled with homework, we tried to develop a mechanism by which the homework was repeatable rather than each night being a separate struggle. Likewise, we had conversations about where homework fit in the overall education, why it was important to the teachers, and the kinds of skills they could learn that would serve them later in life. What I didn't do in that case was do their homework for them. So that's an example where there was no top right. So we're having business conversations that are really consultative and strategic, and we're having technology conversations. This is how you begin to think like a consultant. Again, it's very different if you're walked into the boardroom and having a conversation on the strategy of the company and its future, these existential threats to their very being. I could talk about that in a separate conversation, but that's not what I'm talking about today. Today I'm talking about generally working with IT, generally working with building products. How do we still bring a consultative mindset to what might otherwise be seen as a very technical solution? Before I go on to some other models, I do want to mention one thing. It's actually, although it's nerve-wracking and we have deliverables and we have penalties and we're worried about escalations, it's really exciting to be down here. And it's exciting in a way that can actually be a little bit, it can fool us. It's easy to have conversations and easy to feel busy if we immediately jump on a problem and start asking about formats and layouts and frequencies and channels by which the data is coming. We have to know that. But if we just let ourselves get involved in the fact that there's something tangible that we can work on and deliver, there's enormous satisfaction at a personal level, the way our brains are wired, to deliver very specific items. We have to be careful not to get caught up and confident and comfortable in this spot. We should always be confident here, but we shouldn't be comfortable. We should be asking, what's the business question and what's the common solution? One last warning on this slide. I did mention you have to be careful of knowing when to bring those conversations up and when the client might be in the mood to hear. And also, when you lead conversations to higher levels, you need to know, for example, who has the incentive. For example, let's say that someone comes to you and talks about producing a mailing list with their best customers. Maybe we're in the operate phase. Maybe we're operating this analytical environment. We've got tools that we can quantify expected outcome, lifetime values, and things like that. If we just answer that question, we should be prepared to do that. We were asked for that, and we should be prepared to do that. However, if you're talking to the person who's responsible for print advertising, and you have a broader conversation about why are you spending on print, did you actually do an analytical study of whether print versus everyday low pricing versus improving stores versus online advertising versus paid spokespeople. You know, if you have $1 to spend, where's the best place to spend that dollar? By the way, that is an awesome conversation. If a client comes and says, I have $1, I want to spend it on this project, there's a great question there somewhere as to how they reach that conclusion to spend that dollar. If you start having conversations like that with the business partner that's responsible for print media placement, and you're on the business intelligence BI in a box kind of team that's answering, you don't want to make them begin to wonder whether or not print media is the right answer. You want to find out whether their boss or their boss's boss is perhaps the person to talk about optimizing spend at a higher level. If you're not sure about questions like that, take this interaction here. There's 20-something thousand of us out there listening to conversations like this. Take that to the account team, take that to your management, and ask whether or not there's a good strategy to carry the business conversation, and also make sure that you know what technical tools we have so we move in both directions. From a solution space, if there's an opportunity to build something, for example, in the social media, where we not only say we can onboard the most common social media sites, we know how to read comments fields from all the major newspapers, and we understand the impact of sentiment on brand awareness, pricing, and competitive entry, we could build that into a single solution. We could have KPIs. That's what I meant earlier when I talked about the 80% solution. Cognizant is not in the business, by and large, with a few exceptions like TriZetto and healthcare, of offering what are pure shrink-wrap software products. Take it or leave it. I always tell my clients that we can take them 80% of the way there and tailor it to their distinct marketing strategy for their company. I tell them that for two reasons. First of all, we probably don't have something that we would hand them a shrink-wrap DVD and they would put it on their server. And secondly, that might make our clients anxious because they do feel that they have a unique value proposition or they wouldn't be in the market. I guarantee they've had off-site meetings and talked about differentiators. They've talked about what it is that makes them different from their competitors. They've talked about what themes carry with the consumers. And for us to basically say, we don't care, we're going to give you an algorithm that optimizes your spend on print versus online, is really belittling their own unique value, and they may not want to hear that. The good news is, though, increasingly we're building solutions here. All the major verticals that we support in AIM, we have strategic growth opportunity development, we have KPIs, we have applications on top of big decisions, and we can take them right here for a start. So I hope this model begins to make sense. Let me just jump back very quickly before I make one last comment about value. We traditionally build, we need to think about planning and operating. When we plan, we need to think about what's driving the customer to come to us in the first place. Anxiety and aspiration. And you heard me say earlier, these I believe are neutral terms. You can actually bring this up to them. I wouldn't talk about fear and greed unless you're discussing the movie Wall Street or something like that. Then when you actually get into a situation, use this mental model and ask yourselves, when and how do I carry the conversation to business outcomes? When and how do I recognize that there's a common solution? And do your research, find out if we already have something on Big Decisions or some other platform that can solve that. So I'm going to very quickly leave by talking about how to sound consultative when you're presenting your results. Here's a number, 60. I did a study and this is my conclusion. Any questions? Well, 60 what? I'll say, oh, it's 60%. 60% what? Oh, that's the total dollars for my top 10. Is that good or bad? Oh, that's good, because last year it was 58%. Okay, James, does that mean that we're actually not diversifying? We're placing bigger bets? Oh, no, it's because there was a lot of consolidation in the top 10. Okay, does that mean that the top 10 in the market, what was their actual wallet share? Well, if in the market, my top 10 this year have 70% of the spend, and last year they had 60% of the spend, notice how that changes conversation. If 58% of my money last year came from companies that made 60%, I was really tracking. If now it's 60% of my revenue comes from companies that make 70% in the market, I've actually lost out with the big players. So my point on this is not to talk about market share. My point is everything has to be in context. Those of you that work with me and know me, I have a James rule. I have a bunch of them. One of them is you cannot show a percentage without telling me what divided by what. In this case, it's dollars from the top 10 divided by all my revenue. You also can't show me a number with telling me, is it supposed to be going up or down? Maybe increasing my share of the top 10 is a bad thing. Maybe that means I'm not diversifying. Maybe it's a good thing. That means I've found those really high value clients. Maybe it's just a number I should know, but it's neither good nor bad, it's neutral. You have to explain what the number means, the numerator, the denominator, the context, the external context, and the internal context, and make sure that that's clear. I'm amazed at the number of presentations I see, even from our clients, where they throw out numbers and don't really explain whether it's good or bad. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. We've gone from building to plan, build, and operate. On the planning side, we want to get more deeply involved with our clients up front and afterwards. We have a planning mechanism to understand what's motivating them, what's driving them. We have a mental model we can carry now: listen, lead, distinct, common. And ask yourself, with everything you do of any significant size, if there's an opportunity to carry the conversation sideways or up. And then make sure you stay informed and educated on solutions in the top right. So with that, that closes out the section on how to think like a consultant when you're actually not a consultant. Now, I've also been asked to spend a little time and talk about my experience with Cognizant these past 7 years. It actually was about 7.5 years ago. I joined right before the economic collapse in 2008. Some of you may know my story, but I'll go through it very quickly. I had actually had the privilege of working with the old Dun & Bradstreet Corporation. I worked for a very small company that I founded. It was bought by another small company that was bought by IMS Health, that was bought by Dun & Bradstreet. That Dun & Bradstreet then formed Cognizant largely as a solution to Y2K, among other opportunities. And we all know the story from there. In fact, I was pleased to know some of the key Cognizant people in the very beginning. I didn't actually have the wherewithal to recognize where Cognizant was headed, its size and its growth potential, but I kept in touch with the company over the years. And in 2008, after working with a web startup, a web scraping startup, and a search engine, I had some interest in text mining and wrote Frank D'Souza, who I knew from my Dun & Bradstreet days, and he invited me to send in my resume, and here I am. An amazing thing about the culture has been the absolutely staggering growth. We all know that. That's just a matter of straight fact. You can pull up a chart. But how does one preserve a culture and really a sense of ethics and a sense of work when you grow that quickly? You know, our attrition is not that high by industry standards, but there's a little bit there. We are growing, so we're turning over sometimes 20 or 30% of our headcount every year. In the course of 2 or 3 years, you'll find that most of the people in the company have not been here for more than a couple of years. And yet, they carry the Cognizant work ethic, they carry the Cognizant moral ethics, they carry the Cognizant attitude towards client satisfaction. They've been able to join us in our journey from purely building to planning, building, and operating. They've been able to join us in our journey to think consultatively. I've been privileged to have worked with the CBC organization to help grow our CBC team these past 7 years to where it's now a major player in the company. And we get invited to have strategic conversations, sit in the boardroom, sit with the CXOs, sit with the senior vice presidents, and plan the company. That would have been almost unheard of when I joined about 7.5 years ago. So I've really been pleased with the fact that that grafting of the DNA of Cognizant into new employees takes place so consistently. And I consider that one of the great strengths of working in AIM, that's been the culture and the message, and I've seen it lived out in the lives of my colleagues. So with that, I'm done with this educational session. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you later.